I think a big part of a public official's job, I tell school children, my job as mayor is to be a bridge. My parents gave me a great hometown. I try to make it better, but as I told students today, it's your turn. And so I think we have to look not only at the day-to-day issues, but we have to look to the future. And in my view, I've come to realize that infrastructure around rising sea levels is going to be the biggest infrastructure challenge that this country's ever faced. We're focused now. Why we're focused, and it dawned on me, why is it that we're focused on building roads wider so that people can evacuate for places that may not be here in 30 or 40 years? So I just started to say, if I tell my council members this, they think I'm nuts, or they'll think I'm going off with some left wing or right wing, the Chicken Little, the sky is falling, and talk about climate change. So I said, let's take another route. Let's just look. Let's look at the regular tides. Let's look at the king tides. Let's look over a period of time at what the change was. And within a year, the water on my dock had risen 8 inches. Now, there could be a lot of reasons. It could be that more people built docks, that the creek isn't flowing. Does it matter if there's 8 more inches there? Because if there's 8 more inches there and we have a king tide, that means there's going to be 8 more inches on top of that. If we have a storm surge of 6 feet, that 6 feet's not going to start here, it's going to start here. So when we talk about 2 and 3 and 4 feet, we're adding that to the rain events, which we, for whatever reason, have been having. We're adding that to the storm surge. So we've got a problem that is automatically going to be compounded by nature. And so it's something we need to look about to try to begin to educate the public and the politicians. It's amazing how few people want to talk about climate change. They want to totally dismiss it, or they're in denial because they want to do what they're doing today. And it's transformative. And so I started, South Carolina Small Business Chamber of Commerce came to me, and they said, we'd like to do a pilot, would you be willing? And I said, yes, but I'm not going to put it on my county council, city council. I'm not going to put it on my public works staff, and I'm not even going to put it on the public. Let's me select a group of people, individuals with no authority whatsoever, and let's look at all of the different maps and the modeling that's been done, and just look at our city. And we brought in the town of Port Royal because we're both on Port Royal Island. And we began to look, and we identified places where water's today coming into people's backyards. There's a way to fix that. But if you don't look at it, or if you argue about climate change, how are you going to understand that there's a pipe there and you could put a gate on it and you could stop that water temporarily? Or when we have a Spanish Moss Trail, which is a fabulous trail that goes on one whole shore of the peninsula of Beaufort to Port Royal. Maybe over time you're going to raise that. It's an old railroad bed. Maybe you're going to raise that 6 feet to create a dike. Maybe you're going to have to cut a channel to make room for the water. But if we don't start thinking about it today, it's going to be like other infrastructure problems. We're going to be overwhelmed. So we started our citizens panel. We met at my house at first, and then I got a conference room. And we started with the help of NOAA and some scientists who had to lead us through it. And when we finally came to the end of understanding the potential impact, we then took it to City Council in a work session. I said, I want to share something. And the council said, wow, we really hadn't thought about it this way. And I said, I don't think it's time for any action. We don't have any money, and there's no urgency to do something today. There's urgency to come up with a plan for what to do tomorrow. And so as council, we said, take it out to the neighborhood groups. So they met with the Association of Neighborhood Groups that meet once a month, and then got invited to each of the neighborhoods, specifically those who are affected. And it was interesting because the neighborhood, which is the most valuable real estate in the city, the antebellum homes, the beautiful homes on the neighborhood we call the Point, much of which, of course, was fill, man changing the world. They didn't come to the first meeting. They didn't come to the second meeting. And finally, we did get them to come, and they said, oh my God, what are we going to do? We're going to have to look. Our whole historic district review process is going to have to change because we don't allow the requirements to stay in the historic district. You can't just change a house. You can't raise it 3 feet if that's what your choice is. You can't necessarily move it on the lot because you lock in place when you create a historic district. So we're going to have to look at the whole set of regulations for that. How are we going to manage it? We don't want to lose these treasures. You know, how do we deal with the National Trust, the National Park Service, that give the designations? So my effort has been basically to let the scientists do their work, but to raise the red flag, to ask the questions, to challenge the politicians, to refuse to get involved in the debate about climate change. Rather, let's talk about what happened to that dock in front of my house. And by the way, my neighbor's dock now gets covered at high tide. It was built earlier. I think we're going to have to basically open people's eyes, and I think they'll be scared. I was surprised, and I read pretty much everything I can, and I've been invited, fortunately, to go to these conferences where I learn that there are parts of South Florida that are gone. No chance to mitigate. The soils have been so corrupted and so waterlogged, and the chemicals in the soils have eroded the water pipes, have eroded the sewer pipes. So what you have is water and sewer mixing, so there's no potable drinking water there, and there's no solution. The ground is just soggy because of the hurricanes, because of the rain events, because of the lowness, because of the rising seas. You know, there's only so much water can seep into the ground, and when you're at sea level, there's no place for it to go. So in South Florida, I was joking when I asked someone from the Union of Concerned Scientists who's working with families there. I said, well, who do you take with you? And she said, well, we take estate attorneys, realtors. And I said, do you take hospice nurses? And she laughed. She said, we do. Because we've got some people who've got their life savings and their whole future plotted out, totally invested in something that's going to be gone before they are. How are we going to relocate them? Where are they going to go? How are they going to get their equity so that they can move on? So I think once people begin to see that people's lives are being hurt so badly and that people's plans have been just sort of blown away, that's when we'll get the attention. You know, unfortunately, you've got a bad road and nobody's concerned about it until there's an accident. And they say, why don't you fix the road? Why didn't you fix the road? And we've got that all over South Carolina. You do a referendum to widen a road, and people say, well, they're just spending our money. You run a campaign to widen a road because there have been so many accidents. People will vote for the referendum to pay the extra penny. So I think that we have to do a massive job of public education, and with all deference to the scientists and with all deference to all the causes, I think we need to focus just on the reality. 8 inches, 16 inches, 32 inches. It could be 6 feet. And now they're saying that all the estimates are conservative. We were talking in Beaufort County about 6 feet. At 2100, they've moved that up to something like 2050. So who knows? But the only way to get the attention, I think, is to really put the metal to the elected officials who are going to be. You have to make the hard choices, but it's not a hard choice for me. Do I widen a road for evacuation, or do I try to save the place from which people want to be evacuating? And what's the good of the big road if there's no one coming from there? And so my message is always to talk about sort of the cause and the effect and what it could do. You can ride through the South Carolina low country, whether it's Georgetown, Charleston, Colleton County, and you go across where lots of islands and they're connected by causeways. And it is not rare that on a high tide, or particularly a king tide, these causeways are already covered. And what are you going to do? You're going to build a bridge. You're going to raise the causeway incrementally. Every time you pave a road, maybe you're going to raise it 6 inches, 8 inches, or a foot, put more dirt on it. And that road can also help you control it. You may want to put in large culverts so you can move the water. You may want to put in gates in those culverts so that the tidal areas that fill up, that overflow into people's yards or in their property, you can guide it. But you're always going to have to find a place for the water to go. In Boston, the way they got people's attention, a group, again, I read this, but I read that in Boston, the way they got public attention is they talked about the Back Bay area. The Back Bay area of Boston is near Boston University, very elite, nice, beautiful housing, nice shops. A lot of that was built on fill, again, like the Point in Beaufort. And they talked about building a canal system. What we're going to have to do in the downtown Back Bay area is build canals so the water can get around. We can save some land by giving up some land. Well, I'm not sure that Boston, is excited about becoming the Venice of New England. But all of a sudden, people started to say, maybe we ought to be thinking about this. And so it happens. At the last conference I went to, people in the Northeast who suffered Hurricane Sandy are more keenly aware and excited and doing things than in areas where they haven't. But now with all this inland flooding, these major rivers that come down through the country, that's going to be a problem there. It's not just those of us who are on the ocean. Oh, I think there's no doubt that it's man-made impacts. In the most simple form, where we filled in areas that now there's no room for water. So there's less area for that water. There's no doubt, I think, though I wouldn't use it as my argument with people who are new to the idea, there's no doubt that the glaciers are melting. That with climate change, with the heat caused by the gas, the emissions, that the glaciers are melting. So you've got big rocks of ice that when they become water, the volume increases. So where does that volume go? It goes into the ocean. And when it goes into the ocean, where does it go? It comes up the rivers and the streams into the harbors. So it's a chain effect coming from those glaciers. But there are other things that we do as well. I mean, I personally believe it's blasphemous to say this. We've built too many docks. Because docks don't allow the water to flow or the sand to migrate out. So what we're finding, and I know this in Beaufort County specifically, we're finding that what used to be deep water creeks aren't deep water creeks because the pilings for the docks collect the sand around the bottom, and these creeks are filling in. Now, the Corps of Engineers or U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is already unable to financially keep the intercoastal waterway dredged. We already see where that's filling in, and the demand with the big mega ships probably for intercoastal commerce is probably waning off because of the cost of keeping that ditch that goes from Florida to New York clean. Well, if they can't keep that ditch clean, they're not going to come into the small creeks and into the tributaries. And then when they do that, of course, they damage the habitat anyway. So suck it up, realize the sea is rising, look around you, find the areas where there's definitely something you can do. In some cases, it's not terribly expensive. In some cases, it's long term. So my goal in a small city, we're going to never get attention. So my attitude was, let's get out front. And we're at a point now where we're ready to get a grant for engineering on what we call the hotspots. We've identified the hotspots, the most vulnerable places. And the next is to get a grant and go ahead and engineer it so that when all of a sudden Washington wakes up, Columbia wakes up, and they say we got to do something, I'll give them my drawings, I'll give them my plans, and I'll say let Beaufort, South Carolina be a pilot project, and we'll nudge ahead some of the others. The hotspots in Beaufort, if you go to what we call the Point, the Point is sort of the Williamsburg of Beaufort. It is the pristinely, totally gentrified neighborhood where people have invested tens of thousands, if not millions of dollars, of fixing up old, important, beautiful antebellum homes. But a lot of that land was built on fill, and a lot of that land, you're talking about 12, 14 inches above sea level, and of course they were built up back then, but they weren't built up to face the future. So the way you would deal with that is that fortunately many of the lots already have a seawall because they didn't want the tide coming in their yard. So this is really not a new thing. It's just a boom, a burst of an awareness that it's accelerating. So fortunately around that point, many of the private residences already have seawalls. Now, if you've ever applied to build a seawall, you go through permits with the U.S. because we're in the intercoastal waterway. You go through the Corps of Engineers, you go through Office of Coastal Resource Management at DHEC. Fortunately, what we've learned is that if you extend a seawall inbound and it's not touching the water, people could begin to lift them a foot at a time or 2 feet at a time and begin to build these seawalls to protect. The problem there is that it's private property. So who fixes it? Well, many of the people who think government's too big and takes on too much, all of a sudden are saying, am I going to build a seawall to protect the city? Well, the reality is it's your property and it's your problem. What the city would do is that we have street ends. All of our street ends are open. So we would build, obviously, there, because like a revetment along the beach, one person raises a seawall and the neighbors don't do it, it comes right around it. So one of the hot spots is the downtown historic district. Our waterfront park, which is in the historic district but abuts the Point. We can raise that. We could raise that wall a bit. Another one is out in an area where you'd never expect it. It's called Mossy Oaks, and it's on the western side of the peninsula that runs between downtown Beaufort and the town of Port Royal. And there you have homes that were built low on the creek. But there's a railroad bed. And so as I've mentioned to some people, one of the opportunities now that we've taken this railroad bed and we've built a wonderful biking and hiking and walking and strollering and path, we could raise that and we could actually build a wall there. Another area is as you enter Beaufort on Highway 21. If you could see through the buildings that are there, and we're trying to knock down some more because we're famous for our vistas, and as we redevelop Boundary Street, if you can see through, that tide is almost up at ground level. So there's more likely a chance where you might have to cut a canal right through that quarter of a mile and build a bridge. But that way the water, instead of coming up and over, would go through to the creek on the other side. Those are three of the most principal hotspots, 4 of them actually. It's not in the city of Beaufort, but the whole point is it's not about the city of Beaufort. It's not about Beaufort County. It's about all the coastal communities and inland communities. So you can't isolate it. We could come up with a great program, but if we don't deal with the issues of the rural islands, we're going to have a problem. 1893, you want to frighten people? Take them back to photographs and images of the hurricane of 1893. This island was covered. It was gone. Families, when my grandfather brought the American Red Cross across on one of his company boats. There were animals and people floating out to the ocean, totally covered, the crops. And this is a culture that, when you're out on a place like St. Helena Island, Johns Island, Sapelo Island in Georgia, many of these places that we've managed to keep intact, it's all about self-sufficiency, which, interestingly enough, is what started here at Penn Center with the Port Royal experiment, where the first thing they did was the slaves were given, freedmen were given land, and then the question is, well, they knew how to farm it for somebody else, but did they know the business? Did they know the planting seasons? Did they know the thinking? So there were classes for these people. And the one thing a friend of mine who grew up on this island said, we will never go hungry because we know how to use the land, and we know how to find food in the sea. Well, if that disappears, not only do they go hungry, but they'll lose the land to farm. The sea will get contaminated as more washes into it. So these rural island communities, in many ways, are more at risk, and because they're jagged edges and they're inlets and streams, the complexity of how you save them even is greater. We've seen the barrier islands, and the barrier islands, I don't know why people who have come and basically pushed the limits of the ocean and built these big houses on the ocean, all of a sudden panic when the ocean comes on them. If you look at barrier islands, they shift, they move. That's nature. And so people built houses. Well, we've got the same thing on the inland islands that are protected. I would suspect that the answer here, I'm not the engineer, would be building canals and building a system of ways of keeping some of the land, the highest land, dry at the expense of using the lower land as a repository for that extra water. But very complicated, very expensive, and it's more than a matter of money, because you're talking about the challenge and the loss of a culture. And it's a culture that has come and gone. It's just being revived. Right now, we're proud that we can speak Gullah. We're proud and can finally make a decent amount of money for making a sweetgrass basket. But if the marshes are all swamped, they never dry, where are you going to get the sweetgrass? So it has dire consequences to the rural islands, many of which are financially challenged, less educated, but at least they've learned how to use the land. If you go out and look at some of the gardens here, they're fabulous. If you look and see who's fishing down at the pier or in the ocean, we've got people who do struggle, but they don't struggle like people who live in a city where you go through garbage cans. They can at least grow that okra, those tomatoes, that corn, the collards, the greens in their backyard, and they can go down to a creek and pull up a crab, throw a net and pull up a shrimp. All of that is at risk. If the political will isn't there to fix roads or to spend money on roads that are pet projects rather than necessary, the political will is not going to be there for this. But that is our challenge at local government level and among the grassroots, is to educate the legislators both at home and in Washington. We've got to create the political will. We've got to tap. It's there. People want to survive. People don't want to lose their property. But they just won't wake up to the reality. Someone once told me that the most serious challenge in the treatment of diabetes is not treating a diabetic. It's the diabetic who's in denial, who won't see the treatment. And so my theory is, I'm going to do it. We're going to make it work in Beaufort. And hopefully by doing that, we'll show other people it can happen, and we'll work with them, because we can't do it alone. But fix one problem. Get people happy. Let them see what happens. Don't say we're going to have to spend $300 trillion to build a wall around America. Let's say we've got to get $25,000 for engineering to deal with one area and show people what we can do. And then they're less likely to be in denial. They're more likely to be willing to open up to having the will. But at the moment, it's tough sailing. It's tough because people are so afraid in government of looking at the reality. I mean, look at the bridges. We got unsafe bridges, but they don't spend money on that. We've got potholes that ruin car wheels. We don't spend money on that. We've got cracked sidewalks where people trip and fall. We don't spend money on that. We've got drainage ditches where mosquitoes breed and which create an environmental hazard, and we don't fix. Those are all state assets, and we're not taking care of those. So if we can't take care of those and we can't get the focus on those, we've got a long way to go. But again, it's one step at a time. Let us try our little thing. We travel around, we talk to other people, we try to make it simple. It doesn't have to be complicated. Go back. 8 inches on the dock, 16 inches on the dock, 32 inches on the dock, and all of a sudden the dock's not there. I want my dock. And therefore, I'm going to work to continue